Welcome back to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. We took last week off for the Thanksgiving holiday, but we're back today with one of my favorite guests, Scott Caulfield of CrimsonCast, in my opinion, one of the best voices in the IU community for podcasting. Scott was gracious enough to have me on CrimsonCast last month, and I talked about having him on Podcast on the Brink as part of a home and home. So here he is returning the favor on Podcast on the Brink. Welcome back, Scott.
Yeah, unlike Kentucky, I'm going to come back, in a reasonable time. I'm not going to make you wait till like 2028 to do the home and home. But no, thank you. Let's keep kissing my butt with nice stuff. No, it's good to be on. Love talking with you about IU basketball.
So you were in New York for the Empire Classic. We were talking a little bit about this before I hit record. I didn't want you to go too deep into it. Save some of it for the podcast. But what just your overall impressions of what IU did there in 2 games? Obviously, I know they've had a game since, and we'll kind of dig into maybe the bigger picture of what we've seen through 6 games. But I'm just curious for your takeaways from being in New York and watching the Hoosiers for 2 games back to back.
Yeah, I mean, high level, it's exactly what I thought it was going to be going into it, and that I had thought it was going to be very, very hard for us to beat UConn. Not that because we're bad. I just think it's still a young team that's learning how to play, and UConn is not that. They're everything that we're not. They are experienced. They have a foundation. And then I thought that we would be able to win the second game. I had a feeling we'd play Louisville, although Louisville tried really hard to make us play Texas the second game. And actually, I mean, things broke well because I'm not sure if we would have beaten Texas, and it would have been tough to come out of there with 2 losses. But no, overall, I was happy with that, knowing that kind of expectation going in, talking with a lot of people around there. I think some people were a little bit more frustrated with the loss to UConn, which I understand because it didn't look great. But, you look back at last year and they lost in similar fashion to Arizona, to Kansas, and the season still turned out pretty good. And you're a top 4 seed in the tournament. I'm not saying it's going to happen this year, but, in the second game, I do think there was kind of a moment there in the second half where Louisville made a run. You're down by 4 or 5 or 6. And it's like, you are kind of staring into not the abyss, but like, this would be a bad start to the season, losing to Louisville. They turned it around. Like they went to a 2-3 zone. They made some changes. I'm not trying to be super optimistic, but I do think some people left New York, because Indiana hadn't looked great in the 3 games leading up to it. And then honestly didn't look great in the loss or even the win to Louisville. And we're kind of like, it's tough. I'm trying to look at some of the positives to take away that, they were able to make the changes. They were able to kind of turn things around, close out the Louisville game. And then, the other takeaway that I have is Khalil Ware is the real deal. I mean, we've seen that already. He is. You saw Malik Renew kind of come into his own in my mind. Like his post play was unbelievable. His footwork is awesome. Like he has become the sole focus of the offense. The final takeaway is I'm concerned that we have a similar problem that we had last year, and that last year you had kind of this 2-leg table of Jalen Hood-Schifino and Trace Jackson Davis. We were always looking for who's the third leg going to be. And it was kind of like, who's that going to be? It does feel like we're in a similar situation here where, Malik Renew and Khalil Ware are both, I think, pretty stable legs of that table. I'm not sure who the third leg is. Where I'm more concerned this year is that as good as Ware and Renew have been, this is no knock on them, but like Trace Jackson Davis was an oak tree in the middle. Like you knew what you were getting from him at all times. And as good as Malik Renew's been, like he's still gotten into foul trouble in those games. Like you kind of are down to like 1.5 legs or so, using that analogy. So those are some of my takeaways and kind of how I look at things, moving forward as we leave New York and, this week going to Big Ten play.
So when you had me on CrimsonCast about a month ago, we talked about preseason expectations and Indiana, being kind of a middle of the pack Big Ten team entering the season. As we sit here today, they're 12th among Big Ten teams in KenPom. They've only had 1 game this season, I believe, where they've actually moved up in KenPom after the conclusion of a game, and that was the Harvard game. The first 3 games they moved down, even though they won. I think that kind of speaks to them underperforming in those 3 games despite the wins, and then obviously playing UConn, taking a 20-point loss, and then barely kind of scratching by against Louisville, which is objectively not a very good team. How concerned are you just at this point with where Indiana is? I know that's not the end all be all. They're 5-1, but I feel like these rankings at some point are going to be a little bit more predictive of where this season is going to end up. And I don't know. I'd have to go and do some research, but there's probably not a ton of examples of teams that are this time of year the 12th best team in the Big Ten and kind of in that 70 to 80 range ranking wise, going on to be a solid NCAA tournament team, solid seed. So just kind of where are you at in terms of preseason expectations and kind of what has come to fruition through 6 games?
Yeah, I mean, my feeling going into the preseason, and I still stand by it, is I think this team is going to be different, and I hope, but I believe is going to be better in February and March. So I was expecting some early season struggles, and we're seeing those. And the KenPom doesn't look great, and I will promise I will not be positive the entire time, but I do think just the way that they've played and the opponents they've had, it was just they're going to be bad in KenPom based on the fact that you've had basically 5 of your games against over 150 ranked teams in KenPom, and you've kind of outside of Harvard, you've struggled to really put any of them away and have any good statistics in those games. The one game you played somebody good, you got blown out. So that's going to really hurt all your predictive numbers. When I dig into the numbers, the one thing that I would say, and again, small sample size this year, but the thing that I'm a little bit concerned about is, in Mike Woodson's first year, we were the 24th ranked defensive team in the country. His last year were the 45th ranked team, but the offense got more efficient, so you kind of could understand that. So far this year, we're the 83rd ranked defensive efficiency team. I'm like, I need to pull up the Big Ten. I'm not sure where we fit in the Big Ten in that. To me, that's a troubling trend, is that the defense seems to be sliding. And then, this is the thing that has concerned me about, honestly, the Woodson era as a whole is, everyone focuses on the lack of 3-point shooting. And I have some thoughts on that. But, you can win without shooting 3-pointers. You don't have to. It's going to be a different kind of game, and you're going to have to do some things differently. But, you have to be unbelievably efficient at 2, which Indiana has been, but you also have to play really good defense. And so if we are going to be a team that, right now is 348th in the country in 3-point, made percentage, which is, if not worst, really close to worst, you have to be better defensively. You have to be in the top 25 defensively. And so that is something that does kind of concern me, is that as the athletes have kind of stepped up and as the recruiting has stepped up under the Woodson era, our defense, at least statistically, has gone down. And I think visually you see it as well. Hopefully with this group, it's going to be just kind of having some of the younger guys learn that. But to me, that is the concerning thing that I look at thus far this year, is that trend over the last couple of years.
When you watch the games right now, what is most concerning to you about the defense? I can kind of just tell you from watching and going back and rewatching games, little things like, and this has been brought up a lot, like Mackenzie Mbako, kind of the way he's standing straight up on defense, not getting down in a defensive stance. I know that's caught the attention of a lot of fans, and it seemed like it would be something that would be corrected after a couple of games. He's still continuing to do that. Indiana's still continuing to give up a high volume of 3-point shots. It's not the volume that's concerning, it's the quality of the look. It's fine if a team shoots a 3-pointer if you got a hand in somebody's face and it's a hard contest. They're going to make some of those, but more often than not, that's a shot you live with. But Indiana's not doing that consistently enough. And then the defensive rebounding, to me, at times has been absolutely disappointing. I mean, Malik Renew has been great offensively, but you look at his rebounding numbers, they've been a little underwhelming. I think if I look at this team right now and piece by piece, the only guy I think on the boards that has been kind of as advertised or what you expect is Khalil Ware. So to me, those 3 things kind of all stand out as little things, maybe, but when you add them all together, I think it's a big reason why this team has struggled collectively so far defensively. What are your thoughts, Scott?
I agree. I think those are all valid points. I mean, I'm also concerned that it would be nice to see this team be a little bit more aggressive and honestly just a little bit more kind of going for it on defense and trying to get turnovers. And that, right now they're 172nd in turnover percentage, getting their defense to create turnovers. Last year they were, 294th. Woodson's first year, they were 219. So they've never been good at getting their defense to create turnovers. That would be nice, seeing it's one specific moment, but I do remember in that North Carolina game last year when you had Xavier and Jalen Hood-Schifino both in the backcourt, like they were trapping and they were causing all kinds of havoc, and it caused a lot of turnovers and it got the team in transition. And again, that's where if you're not able to shoot threes or you're not going to shoot threes at a high volume, getting more transition baskets is really going to help. And it does seem like this team is built, but with it, Ware and Renew and Mbako, like, and then, with Xavier Johnson running the point, like if you can get some transition going, you can really cause some problems, but it doesn't, to me at a high level, like everything you said is true. I'm not going to go over that again, but it doesn't feel like the defense is kind of gambling is not the right word, but just trying to put the offense into the other team's offense into bad situations. And I guess at a high level, that's what is concerning to me about the defense is it feels like even the games we've seen this far with Army and Florida Gulf Coast, like they're coming in and they're running their stuff and they're running the stuff they want to run. And it doesn't feel like our defense is putting them in positions where they can't run their stuff. And that's been the concerning part to me is that it feels like with those types of teams, you should be able to impose your will because we're going to get teams like Purdue and Michigan State where they're going to run their stuff. And like, you're not going to be able to like, that's going to be the problem. But if you can't, get Louisville to do something different or Florida Gulf Coast to really make them play with one hand behind their back, if you're letting them do what they want to do on defense, that really concerns me for how it's going to look in the Big Ten.
Yeah, they're not dictating what happens on a given possession. I think that's kind of listening to what you said. I think that's kind of summing up my feelings on it is that if you sit back and wait for something to happen, then you're going to get, a breakdown in the half court. You're going to get a guy that misses an assignment, and then you're going to end up with the other team making an uncontested 3-point shot, what you see time and time again this season. I think you make a really good point because in some of those games last season, when Indiana was at its best defensively, and even going back to the first year of the Woodson era, they were, making it difficult on the first pass when a team comes up the court, right? Make somebody get the offensive possession for the opposing team off to an uncomfortable start.
Right.
Take them off their first read. Make them do something different. But if you're just going to let a guy drive enter the ball where they want to enter it, and then kind of just be reactive to everything, you're going to get these results. And you're exactly right. Against Purdue, against Kansas, that type of intensity on defense or that kind of awareness is not going to get you very far. So I think it's very concerning. I do want to talk about the 3-point shooting because it's something I get.
One other thing with the defense is I also think, this is always one of my tropes in the beginning of the year is, you listen to pregame stuff. And I'm guilty of this also, but everyone kind of looks at it and it's like, you're like, you look at the roster to start the year. It's like, man, are we going to have enough time for these? Are we going to have enough minutes for these guys? And then it's like, you get to now and it's like, man, we're really don't have a lot of guys to play. It's like,
exactly.
It is funny how quickly that changes. But I do think part of the problem too, is that once you get out of the starters and into the bench, which we've done, a lot of our bench guys are just not great defenders. And it's no knock on them. They can get better. But like Gabe Cupps is playing 45% of available minutes, and he's not a great defender. He'll get there, but he's a freshman. So like, I'm not expecting him to be a good defender. CJ Gunn is having a hard time kind of providing value on either end of the court. His defense has been very suspect. Caleb Banks, I think, has been good. I think Peyton Sparks has been good. Walker has been kind of hit and miss, but you very quickly get to a point where these guys are playing a lot more minutes than I think any of us thought. And unfortunately, they just aren't as good defensively as some of the other players. And you're getting into spots where, Xavier's getting into foul trouble, and then you're getting more and more Gabe Cupps. And I think that's hurting the defense. And again, I'm not trying to talk bad about them, but it's just there's a definite drop off of defense from, Xavier to Gabe, and it'll take him time. But I think you're seeing that as well, that we're getting to that second unit quickly. And I think second unit is just very poor defensively at this point.
Yeah, I thought in that Harvard game, kind of one of the things that changed the momentum, I thought Indiana got off to a pretty good start. And then I think I tweeted this, it was like just over 13 minutes left in the first half. The entire second unit was on the court. And I'm like, 7 minutes into the game, I'm not questioning, Mike Woodson knows 100 times more about coaching basketball than I ever would, but it just feels like from a momentum standpoint, when you take the entire scheme of what was working off the court and put in an entirely new lineup, I just don't think you're putting your team in the best positioned for success. What are your I mean, this has kind of been a point of contention with Woodson for the first couple of years, like these line changes where all of a sudden like 4 or 5 guys are coming in. We see that in the NBA. I know you watch the NBA quite a bit. I watch the NBA, but it's a different quality of player that you're bringing into the game in the NBA. You're bringing in guys that there's probably not going to be as steep of a drop off. And all of a sudden you're up a couple points against Harvard playing pretty well. There's not foul issues. And then you got 5 other guys. It's only a 40-minute game. I mean, play your best guys as much as you can and maybe mix some subs in, but the 5 subs at once thing to me is not necessarily the best way to go about it.
I agree. I'm not as concerned with the 5 subs at once, but what I'm concerned with, and I saw this in New York a couple times. I said it to the people sitting next to me. I say it almost every game to somebody who's sitting next to me. So if you're sitting next to me, you'll hear this because unfortunately it happens. It's almost like this is not a good lineup. And I feel like I can see it. I'm not saying I'm smart or anything, but I can see it when there's like 4 guys out there and it's like, man, who's going to score in this lineup? And it's like, you'll have a lineup with, like Gabe Cupps and Trey Galloway, who's been, struggling, and like, Anthony Walker, Peyton Sparks, and CJ Gunn. And it's like, where's the offense supposed to come from this? Like, you have a lot of guys who are struggling to find their role on this team, where their shots are, and it feels like you get just all of them out there at once. And you're right, you can do that in the NBA because even in the NBA, someone like Isaiah Jackson, who's like a backup for the Pacers, Duke can score. Like, the guy can get his own plays, and he can do that, and they can run sets for him. That is where my concern is. As I look at it, you do have to work with the minutes, but it's like, in my mind, you shouldn't have a lineup out there that doesn't have either Renew or Ware in at any point. Like, you play them together and then you start staggering them for, the 15 to 20 minutes of the game. And, you start with them for 10 minutes, you end with them for 10 minutes, you stagger in the middle, but one of the 2 of them should be in at all times, in my opinion. And we don't seem to do that. And I do think that it allows the other team to kind of take a sigh of relief. It's like, all right, well, we know we're not going to get crushed in the post for the next 4 or 5 minutes. And so to me, that's the biggest concern that I see. Again, we always say this, Woodson knows more, and these coaches know more than we do. So he's doing it for reasons, but I don't know. I don't particularly see I don't see what's going on. And unfortunately, the results aren't showing whatever the reasons are to there. So that's my concern with some of the lineups and the adjustments.
So one of the things I'm asked about the most is, should Indiana be shooting more 3-pointers? In the Inside the Hall community, it's a question that I get all the time. People want to know, why aren't we taking more threes? Why aren't we emphasizing it? Mike Woodson on his radio show last night, even kind of like, I don't want to say punched back at the media, but had some quotes just about the media saying we should shoot more 3-pointers. It's not like I'm telling these guys not to shoot 3-pointers. And when you do look at the roster, you're like, okay, who do you want on this team right now taking a high volume of 3-pointers? Trey Galloway's shot has looked absolutely, a show of what it was last season, early on this season. Xavier Johnson's been in and out of the lineup. Last game, he didn't even play the second half with injuries. He's a guy that can make threes, but he's not a high volume 3-point shooter. Mackenzie Mbako, he's been poor from the perimeter, to say the least so far. Khalil Ware is the guy you really want doing most of his work on the paint. I mean, if he comes out and takes a couple of threes a game, I think that's fine. And then you look at the guys on the bench. I mean, Gabe Cupps is, a point guard. He's a freshman. He's not going to be a high volume 3-point shooter. CJ Gunn has not been able to make 3-pointers consistently. Caleb Banks came in last game and made a couple. I thought, that was actually an encouraging sign to me that he kind of took those 3-pointers and made them without hesitation. Like, that's something that could maybe be built on, but I'm just not seeing the personnel to maybe shoot more threes. So I think that's part of the reason, but I'm also wondering how you could be in year 3 of your tenure at IU and not have more shooting on the roster. So it's kind of like, it's fine to say, we're not telling these guys not to shoot, but why don't they have more shooters, I think, is a big question. But overall, just kind of, where do you fall on this whole, should Indiana be shooting more 3-pointers? Do they have the roster to do it? Is this going to be kind of the downfall of this team? Because you can't continuously get outscored by 15 or 20 points a game from the 3-point line. I guess you can if you're winning the points in the paint by 20 or 30 like they have, but I don't think you're going to do that against the best teams in the Big Ten.
I agree. I mean, I knew you were going to ask this question just because, like, it is kind of the gnawing question for Indiana is like, can you win without shooting threes? And it's tough because it's not as, like we said, I watch the Pacers a good amount as well. They're fun to watch because they just go nuts and they shoot. And in an odd way, their offense is like their defense because they score so much. They are actually very efficient with the ball. And so they put the other team's offense in tough positions because you got to keep up and you got to score. We do that to an extent at IU with our, 2-point percentage shot. We're 11th in the country, 60% from two. That's unbelievably efficient. But, if a team just kind of gets lucky or gets hot and hits 2 or 3 threes, you're now down 4 points, even though you've been more efficient and you probably run better stuff. I don't have I think they should be shooting more threes. The fact there aren't people on the roster who can shoot threes, that's a Woodson problem. I mean, he's built this roster and why we aren't able, I'm constantly amazed these teams that, come through like, Florida Gulf Coast or Army always has a kid who just goes bananas from three. And I think to myself, we're IU fans, so we obviously have a little bit of a pedestal we stand on. It's like, dude, if we just offer that kid a scholarship, like I'm sure he would have come to IU over Army or Florida Gulf Coast. Why are we not able to find these people, year in, year out? We used to be able to. But here's the other way that I'm looking at it is, I remember when Woodson was hired, one of the stories was, Steve Novak would talk about how that guy got me a contract in the NBA. And, Woodson created an offense with the Knicks in 2012 that got Steve Novak a ton of 3-point shots. You look at last year, our two, Ken Pom ranks people on the team by the number of, minutes they use. And so you're kind of top to bottom. The two highest 3-point shooters on the team last year were Tamar Bates and Miller Kopp. And not insignificant. Bates took 99 threes, shot 37%. Kopp took 142, was shooting 44%. They're at the bottom of the list in usage. Kopp was nearly invisible and Bates was a limited role category. So you're using Kopp as kind of just a catch and shoot guy, which is fine. But you look at I'm trying, these aren't great comps, but like Fletcher Lawyer with Purdue, he was used 71% of minutes. He shot 40 more threes and he only shot 32% from three. So I look at this and I do kind of struggle with last year you would have kind of said, just knee-jerk reaction. We don't have any 3-point shooters. Like, well, you kind of did. You had Miller Kopp and you had Tamar Bates. Like, are you running enough sets for them? Are you using them? Or do you just not want to run this offense to shoot threes? I get the other side is you have Trace Jackson Davis. You have all these other pieces. I'm with you, but this year you look at the numbers and it's very small sample size, but Xavier Johnson is shooting 50% from three. Khalil Ware is shooting 50% from three, but they've combined only taken 18 threes. I know it's an unbelievably small sample size, but to me, it's like, hey man, Khalil Ware is shooting 50%. His stroke looks good. He's able to get open. Like, why is he not taking 4 or 5 threes a game? I'm with you. I feel like I continually try and find ways to defend. Like, you can play this way without shooting threes, but in the end, it's a very tough way to play. And the trouble with it is you can play exceptionally well. And if another team just gets hot and hits 2 or 3 threes, you're suddenly down 5 points. And then the kind of the dynamics of the games change, because I felt this way a lot of games last year where it's like you're down by 6 points with 4 minutes to go. And I'm already thinking in my head, all right, we only have 6 more possessions. So we need to get 4 stops because we're not going to score more points per possession than they are because we're doing 2 for 2. So if they hit a 3, it's like with 6 minutes to go in the game, you're already looking at the game theory and it's like, we're kind of screwed. So I think you can do it, but it's exponentially harder to win that way unless you can shoot some threes. So I don't think anybody has an answer. I think it's very perplexing.
Yeah. Couple of things. One, you kind of alluded to this earlier. If you're not going to be an elite defensive team, then and you're kind of Indiana's right now, they're what you said in the top 100 in efficient affect Ken Pom's defensive numbers, but
yeah,
among power conference teams, they're probably closer to the bottom because we know these rankings are skewed based on the competition that they played. So
and they're 12th in the Big Ten.
Being in the 80s is not where you want to be. You want to be at least top 50, if you're going to be a team that's making deep tournament runs, you want to be in the top 20, to be honest, because that's what's going to get you to where you want to go. So if you're going to have this style play offensively, you better be able to stop the other team. Indiana so far has not proven that they can really stop teams consistently this season. The other thing is, and Dan Hurley kind of alluded to this in his post-game comments after the UConn game, you're very easy to guard if the other team knows that all you're going to do is go into the post every time and you don't have anybody that can get the ball out to and make a shot, or you're not going to create shots from the perimeter, because we saw this going back to the Archie era with when he was trying to play Justin Smith and I don't know who the other big guy was together. And it was basically like, it might've been the Romeo year where they literally just, it was like teams were just collapsing on Romeo and Juwan Morgan and there was no one else to make a shot. And I think the maddening thing for IU fans is like, okay, this is the state of Indiana, like the home of basketball. There's got to be a kid somewhere that can make shots. And when we saw the Wright State game, the kid, I think Wellage was his last name. He's from Indiana. He hadn't scored the whole season. I think he came in the game and hit 6 or 7 3-pointers. So just find a guy that, and I know Miller Kopp was supposed to be this, and quite frankly, I think he was a little bit underutilized in terms of the volume of shots he could have been taking. They didn't run anything for him. It was just like he was an afterthought. If he was open in the corner and he got the ball, he shot it. But it wasn't like they ever ran anything to get him open. And he shot a really good percentage. So I think that's the reason that people are most frustrated with it, is because they think it's Indiana. We should always have a shooter. And the defense doesn't really set you right now. The defense is not good enough to where you're just going to be able to hang in against the better teams by giving up that many points. Teams that can make 9 or 10 threes a game and you're making 3 or 4, you've dug yourself a hole. I mean, are you going to do that against Purdue and in Kansas? Those teams can also score in the paint and they can shoot 3-pointers. So it's just a tough thing. And I think I think the number one priority moving forward, not to get past this season, but I think for Indiana and recruiting, and they've done this to an extent already with this next class with Liam McNeely, getting him. He's a guy that can shoot from the perimeter, but you gotta have 2 or 3 guys on the court at all times that can make a shot from the perimeter. And that hasn't been the case really since Tom Crean. You know, say what you want about Tom Crean, his defense's teams weren't very good, but he always had guys that could make perimeter shots for the most part. James Blackman, Nick Zeisloft, Yogi Ferrell, go down the list, Max Bielfeldt. These are guys that could knock down perimeter shot. Robert Johnson. I mean, Indiana doesn't have any of those guys right now, and I think that's really kind of just I think disappointing, because if this roster did have a guy or two that could make 3-point shots consistently, imagine how it would be a pick your poison type situation. You're gonna let Khalil Ware play 1-on-1. You're gonna let Malik Renew play 1-on-1. You know, that's you're putting a lot of pressure on a defense, but when there's no threat from the perimeter, I think it's really hard to overcome, especially once you get against better teams.
Well, there is a disconnect somewhere, because you hear Woodson continually say this is like, hey man, like I want to shoot threes. Like I tell him to shoot. And it's like, well, I watch the games. It doesn't look like they're comfortable shooting. Like it looks like they've been told something else, because you watch the games and they're tentative and they're not looking. He said, like, they're not looking for guys like Miller Kopp, and you see Trigg. I think Trigg is having some issues this season anyway, but like he looks tentative when he's shooting. Like Xavier Johnson, like, everyone just seems like their first option isn't just to fire. Unlike when you watch the Crean teams, I'm not saying that was the best, but you'd be like, man, dude, they were green lights all over the place. Like they could just fire from wherever they wanted. Like James Blackman Jr., just like you had a green light anywhere. This team they don't play like that. So there's a disconnect there when Woodson's saying, hey man, they can go. And it's like, but tell them that at some point, like maybe. I mean, the other thing, this is probably a scarecrow argument. Like, I don't know if it's real or not, but because Woodson has done a great job in the portal and done great job recruiting. So I'm not saying that, but I do wonder if this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where, Woodson is older, comes from the NBA. So there's already this feel of like, does he understand the college game? Is he up to date with the newest trends? And then he's playing a very kind of older style of basketball. I'm not saying it can't work, but when you look at how basketball is evolving, it's not evolving toward the way that Woodson's playing. Now, I'm not saying you have to follow the leader, but, there is a world where if you're a young, hotshot 17-year-old who wants to just fire, if you're the next James Blackman Jr., just because it came up in my head, and you just want to go and fire away and be the next Steph Curry or Trae Young, you're not going to look at IU's offense the last 3 years and be like, that looks like a dynamic, fun offense that I can play. And it kind of looks like an old stodgy offense that's throwing the ball into the post. So I do worry, like, if this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where it's like, if I'm the young gunner, if I'm the next Trae Young or Buddy Hield, like, do I want to go play for this older coach who seems to be running kind of an antiquated style? And it's the frustrating part about it is when we hired Woodson, I went back and looked at it. I was joking, like he did small ball and threes before anybody else. Like that Knicks roster in 2012 had no business being the number one 3-point shooting team in the league. It was like Jason Kidd and J.R. Smith and Steve Novak. It's like guys who were just not career great 3-point shooting teams, and they shot more threes than like anybody in the league by an order of magnitude. This was like 3 years before the Warriors did what they did, and so it's like. What I don't get is I was like, well, that's cool, but he was ahead of the curve then. And I think we all thought he was building the offense around what he had with Trace Jackson Davis. And maybe again, it's like he's just building around what he has with Malik Renew and Khalil Ware. But I'll go back to him, and Khalil Ware is shooting 50% from 3 on 8 shots. But it's like, give him more. Why not give him 3 or 4 a game? Like if he can shoot 34% from 3 and be the 7-foot presence he is, that maybe your double poison is right there in one player.
Yeah, I think it has to be partly just kind of a carryover of the first 2 years he really had to do everything through Trace. And then now, it's not like they didn't try in the portal. I mean, they really tried to get Dalton Connect to visit. And every day as I watch his highlights on Twitter, I'm like, what would this Indiana team look like with this guy on the roster? It'd be completely different. They tried with some other guys too. So it wasn't for lack of trying, but I think there's nothing you can do about this season. I think moving forward, you've got to get some guys that can make perimeter shots, and I think they will address it. So,
well, you got to get some guard play too. I mean, it's Xavier's had a rocky start to the year. It looks like he might still be injured. He's nursing now another foot injury. He's having the same problems he's had in the past of getting into foul trouble, and then you just have to look at, like I was kind of looking at preparing for our talk today. Looking at Trey Galloway's numbers, and it's kind of frightening how bad he's regressed back to what he looked like his freshman and sophomore year. And you worry, as like, was last year the outlier? Was that the outlier because you had so many good players that he was able to kind of get the third, fourth person on defense, and now that he's taking that step up, last year he had an offensive rating for the season of 117.5. He was 200th in the country in that. This year he's back to 99.5. That's worse than he was his sophomore year. It's back to his freshman level numbers. And it's just, you need more out of Trey Galloway. You just need more efficient play out of Trey Galloway. And I think that's part of the problem as well, is it's our backcourt play has not been even to the level that we had last year.
Of the bench guys, from what you've seen so far, which guys do you feel like have earned an opportunity for consistent minutes now that we're getting into Big Ten play? I think, you may have to play 9 or 10, but you maybe trim it down a little bit and roll with the guys that have earned it to this point. Who, in your mind, of the bench guys, do you think have maybe stood out and maybe separated themselves a little bit?
I mean, I've been really, especially in New York, I was really impressed with Peyton Sparks. Just in that, like, he gives you exactly what you need. Like, you bring him in, he harkens back to kind of an older, like, Bob Knight type player, where it's like he doesn't need the ball, he just comes in and plays really solid defense. He's a brick down there. He's like, watching him in person is like, man, that dude is big. Like, he's big, and guys are bound, and he likes to use his body. I struggle because, like, you're not going to get 20 points a game out of Peyton Sparks, but you can plug him in for 4 or 5 minutes. Again, back to that idea of, like, use him to kind of go between Ware and Renew back and forth. I've been impressed with him. I also think, I like what I'm seeing out of Anthony Walker. I think you're starting to see him figure out his place. I mean, he had 11 points against Louisville, 9 points against Harvard. That's somebody who's kind of come in and, even in the games where he struggled, he's still putting up 5 points, here and there. I think if he can keep in that range of, like, being able to always provide 7 to 11 points, I feel like he's been good. He's getting slowly better defensively. And, that's the kind of bench player you need, unlike, not picking on him, but like last year, Tamar Bates, where it's like, you just didn't know what you were getting. It's like, are you getting the grab bag where he's hitting a bunch of threes? Or are you getting the grab bag where he's just completely, like, zoned out, not sure what you're getting? It does feel like with Walker, you know what you're getting. And it feels like it's kind of rounding into shape as like that, Louisville, Harvard type performance.
All right, Scott, before we wrap up, I got to ask you, IU football needs a coach. first of all, are you in the running for the position? Because there's been no leaks to this point. Who better than to lead IU football than a man who's watched more IU football than definitely than I've watched? Because I don't. I'm more of a casual observer. I'll watch, back that 2020 season where they were beating Penn State and you had the Penix dive to the end zone, and then the following season where they were ranked to the preseason and things obviously didn't turn out very well. But I mean, this is obviously a big decision coming up in all seriousness. I know you follow the program as closely as anybody. I'm just kind of curious what your, I guess, thoughts on the dismissal of Tom Allen, which, quick story here. I've only ever spoken to Tom Allen one time. It was, obviously I don't cover IU football, but I was at Huber's. It was 2 years ago. So not this past May, but May of 22, I believe it was. And before the event, they kind of have us in this area where the media and some of the coaches and the other people from IU are there, aside from like the ballroom where all the, not a ballroom, but it's like a big area where all the people are eating the food and where they go out and speak. Well, I was just back there eating, and Tom Allen walked up with his plate of food and like put his plate next to me. And I just started talking to him. Like he had no idea who I was. He would have no reason to idea who I was because I don't cover IU football, but I was there as a media person. Just started talking to him, was asking him like all these questions about like football because I don't know a lot about it, and just the road environments in the Big Ten, like which place was his favorite to go play, and what was the most difficult environment, and just kind of what he liked about his team and all that. I mean, just the nicest, genuine person. Like a lot of people you talk to, and you can tell like they're just like, it's like small talk, and they just want to end the conversation and move on to the next thing. Maybe go shake some donors' hands or do something else. Like he sat there and talked to me for like 10 or 15 minutes and like answered every question, and like he just seemed like a genuine good guy. So for that reason, like I hated to see like it not work out for him in Indiana, but also understand that it's a business and you have to win, and the results the last couple of years have not been up to par. And I think he kind of said that in his statement, like in even the last post-game press conference that he did, thanked the media and kind of thanked the fans and everything, but realized like he had to win more. So like, I think he gets it. So for those reasons, like, I was sad to see him not work out because I do think he generally loved being the coach at Indiana, had the best interest of the players and program at heart, but it didn't work out. So what's next here? Like what does Indiana need to do here because this is like, I feel like we get to the same point every time with this. It's like, all right, they're going to make a change and then they end up in the same position. Is it something bigger that needs to be done? Not just the coach. Is it a bigger investment in the program? We hear people talk about that a lot, like, or more resources into the program. What does that mean? So I'm just kind of giving you the open mic here to give me your thoughts on this football search and kind of what needs to happen here for Indiana to quite. I think it's important, right, that they stay kind of. They haven't, quite frankly, haven't been wrong. I think it's important that they develop some relevancy in the Big Ten, because you look at this new 18-team league that's going to start next year. They're 17 or 18 probably historically in the league. And I've always wondered, like, what's going to happen if there's ever a super league in football? Indiana's probably not going to be near the top of the list to be included in that. So I think it's important that they at least do something to kind of try to move up a couple spots on the totem pole.
A lot to chew on there. I'm not running for coach. So yeah, I'm taking my name. I officially use this platform to say
breaking news.
Breaking news. I'm not going to coach IU. Although I was joking with some friends for the bucket game. I was like, why don't we just have like Woodson and Painter coach the football teams? Like, see what happens. Like, we both kind of don't like our football coaches. Like, who knows? Like, you never know. I joked on one of our podcasts, like, I was like, you should hire Brad Stevens as the football coach, and then just be like, tell Woodson, hey, you still got 5 years. And it's like, Brad Stevens knows coach. Anyway, total joke. I'm going to kind of argue against myself to make my own points, is that a lot of things that I hear with IU football, I really bristle at it. And the first one was that, and I honestly didn't think they were going to fire Allen based on the money as well, just because it was a very large buyout number. And people are like, man, why does IU pay that? It's like, well, because I believe, and we'll see, I could be proven wrong on all of this. I do believe that this is the another step in IU taking football seriously. And if you want to take football seriously, the record the last 3 years has just been unacceptable at a Power 5 level. And I'm with you. I like Tom Allen as a person. I thought after 18, 19, 20, I felt like we had kind of moved out of the muck and gotten a new floor. And that's what was so tough seeing it happen. But it was, different podcasts. We talk about it a lot on CrimsonCast. The program did feel rudderless. You had to make this change, and they did. And so that's the first thing is, and this is right, God, so much money. It's like, well, there's a lot of money coming in. Like they just signed big TV deals. Like you raise the money coming in, the money going out is going to get bigger as well. So there's that. I get the sense that IU understands how important this hire is. And you look back, of their last, they haven't done a national coaching search since they hired Kevin Wilson. Like when Kevin Wilson got fired, it was very odd circumstances, and Allen was just named head coach at, the same time they fired Wilson. That was before a bowl game, but you go even before that, they did a search for Hepner, but then when Hepner passed away, they just hired Bill Lynch without doing a search. So 2 of our last 4 coaches, we didn't do a search. I would argue that's not taking football as seriously as some programs should. The sense that I get in talking with a few people is that it did feel like that the die was cast a couple of weeks ago. I have a very hard time. I don't know anything. I just have a very hard time believing that if you're Scott Dolson, you just woke up on Sunday and it's like, all right, we're going to do the buyout. And now here's a blank whiteboard. Who are we going to start looking at? Like, I think that, that they have their eyes on certain people. I just saw today that they hired a search firm, and people are like, why are you just doing this today? It's like, well, it's being announced today. I don't think they just hired the search firm. It's also possible the coach that they want, they already identify, they've had discussions with, and maybe he just works with that search firm and they're just trying to grease some agents. I mean, it's a dirty business. Things happen. The other thing that I will argue against is people will be like, well, who wants to go to IU? Like, it's a horrible job. It's tough. And it's like, my answer is always this. Any coach who's not in the Big Ten or the SEC should want to come to IU, because we have more money. And if we are able and willing to use those resources, there's no reason why any other coach in the country who's not in the Big Ten or the SEC wouldn't want to come coach at a Big Ten school, because there are 2 power conferences, to your point, and 2 conferences that could become the Super League. And by birthright, we were born into the right conference, but we are one of those teams. And you see it with Michigan State. Michigan State over the last 5 years is no better, and I could even say worse than Oregon State. Jonathan Smith was the coach at Oregon State. He was an alumnus. He played at Oregon State, and they just pulled him from Oregon State to Michigan State for, a couple of reasons. But I think the number one is that Oregon State no longer has a conference. And so Michigan State is a much more attractive job now. And so I look at, Washington State, schools that are going to the Big 12, Arizona State. I'm not saying any of these coaches are good for us, but it's like all of those coaches would want to come to Indiana. Indiana has to treat this like a real search. They have to put the real resources behind it. And I'm kind of done hearing those tropes of like, man, it's a lot of money to spend. We're going to spend 15 million, 20 million to fire a coach. You got to go and turn around and spend more. It's like, yes, this is a very expensive business. But again, like, go back and look at the TV deal they just signed with CBS. Like, there's money there. They just did a big NIL day. There's NIL dollars there. I think Indiana is a very attractive job. It's not more attractive than Ohio State or Michigan or Penn State, but to me, again, it's more attractive than any other job. It's not a Big Ten or an SEC school. And I view this as Indiana taking it seriously. The last thing I will say is I think that a lot of people do fail to realize just how far Indiana has fallen by not providing resources to football, not in the last 5 or 10 years. I think in the last 5 or 10 years, they have really stepped up their efforts to provide resources to football. But from like 1950 or 60 to like 2010, there was not a ton of interest in putting resources into football, while other schools like Purdue and Illinois and Northwestern and Wisconsin were putting money toward football. I mean, in 1940, Indiana was no different than Wisconsin. Like, they just weren't. And then Wisconsin in the 70s and 80s, they made a good hire in Barry Alvarez, and they just started putting money into football. They started building those facilities. And that's a 40-year gap that just 1 year of, just in the last, 15, 20 years, we're like, all right, we're going to start putting more into football. It's like, great. You're still 40 years behind teams like Wisconsin. So I think people forget just how far we have fallen and how much we have to do to catch up. But so I'm excited. No, they could go out and make the wrong hire. I don't know. I mean, I would say that, where Indiana's had the most success in football is under coaches like Hepner and Bill Mallory. And those were coaches who had coached and been head coaches at other areas and had success. Mallory had success in the MAC, success at Colorado. Hepner had success at the MAC. Where Indiana has struggled is when you take coordinators and try and move them to a head coach position. You look at Kevin Wilson. It took him 2 or 3 years to kind of figure out how to be a head coach. It took Tom Allen a year or two to figure out. I think you could honestly say it's one of maybe his faults is not being able to stop being a defensive coordinator and just being a head coach. And unlike basketball, there is just head coach. I know it sounds stupid. We talk about it all the time. It's like head coach is such a different job than the coordinators. And you see it time and time again. It takes guys a year or two to figure out, how do I become a CEO of a football program and how do I do this? And so I don't think that Indiana has the time to have somebody learn on the job again. So to me, my ideal candidate would be somebody who has had success at a high level, D1 program as a head coach, and you can basically use the resources of the Big Ten to pull them away from a school that isn't a Big Ten or SEC school. That's what I think they should be looking at. And I think we're going to know sooner rather than later, because, the portal opens up, I think, December 4th. So you can't take too much time with this.
Yeah, the whole idea that nobody wants to come to IU is a silly argument for a couple reasons. One, whoever you hire is going to get paid a ton of money, so people like money, so they're going to come. Two, if you actually come to Indiana and just go 500 every year, a little bit over, and go to a bowl game every year, you can use that as a stepping stone to the next job, because nobody can do that consistently in Indiana. So if you are able to do that, then that's going to be attractive for the next step in your career. Maybe you don't ever find a guy that wants to be there for the long term, but if you can at least get a baseline of expectations of just making and the bar is not very high to make a bowl game. You just have to win. You just go 500 and you're in a bowl game. I think Indiana football fans, if you told them, all right, we can sign up for the next 10 years and 8 out of 10 years, we're going to go to a bowl game, and that's all you told them, people would take that, right?
Yeah, no, they wouldn't. What's funny is you bring that up, and people's first, I hear this a lot. It's like, man, well, God, what if we get a coach and he's good and he leaves? Like, great. I'm always like, that would be awesome. And
it's like guys going early to the NBA, right? I mean,
yeah, no, it's a good
thing. Jalen Hood-Schifino went to the NBA after year. Good.
It's two things to it. It's like, first off, like, I have a 10-year-old son. It's like, I'm not so worried about, man, what's his dorm going to be like in college? Like, we're 8 years away. Like, there's a lot of things happen between then and now. But secondly, it's like, people, it's funny they say this, like, I'm always like, go back and look at the history. Name me the coach since World War II that left Indiana for a better job. Because we're going to be waiting for a while, because it hasn't happened, because all football coaches here get fired. Like, so if it happens, it'll be the first. It's awesome. And like, that's the sign of a good program, is like, we're not a destination. I don't think I'm breaking news to anybody. Like, that's the first step to building it. The other thing is, as I don't want to sound mean toward Tom Allen, but when you look at Indiana, like, it is a very, the expectations are low, but it's also like the pressure is really low. Allen mismanaged the quarterback position this year, going into the season, who's going to be starting doing all this stuff. He mismanaged timeouts all the time. The end of that Michigan State game was baffling. Very few questions, like, just very few questions, a couple here and there. And then it's like moving on. Like, there's not a lot of, like, versus, like, and I know it's different, but like, Ryan Day has gone 11-1, like 3 years in a row, loses to Michigan, and people are like, man, this guy sucks. We got to get him out of here. Like, he's getting hit on everything. It's like, you can make a ton of mistakes here, and there's not a lot of people. There's very few people covering it. IU football Twitter is empty. There's not a ton of pressure or really pressing questions with Indiana football. So I've always thought it's a very low stress job, and I don't have a lot of sympathy for the coaches at IU, because like, they're not getting pressure like they are anywhere else.
Well, Scott, I appreciate you coming on the show. It's been a lot of fun. And if you are interested in more IU football talk, I'm sure CrimsonCast will have you completely covered. Whenever the hire is made, they'll have it covered from every angle. As Scott said, I think, I don't know, obviously, a lot about college football, but you mentioned the portal opening. I think you have to have somebody in place before the portal opens, right?
100%. I want to ask you one last question. We'll flip back. Everyone's already left because we're talking football, but we'll just with basketball. You've asked me a lot of questions. Appreciate it. I love coming on. I'm just curious how, now that we're at this point, let's do it again let's do a home and home at the end of the season. But how how are you feeling? Like, I will answer my own question. Like, I still like the trajectory of this team. I still think for basketball, it is where I thought it was going to be, maybe slightly below, but we'll see. How are you feeling with where the team is at now? And is your kind of end of season projection or feelings changed?
I feel a little bit better after the Harvard game because that was the first time I feel like they actually went out and like took care of an opponent the way they should. The first 3 games, obviously, were teams that they should have beaten more handily than they did. And you can chalk that up to just being a new team or whatever, but I felt like those should have been all more comfortable than they were. I expected them. I said before on our community, I said before the UConn game, I said it would be 18 to 20 points, and it was 20 points. So that was right in line with expectations. Couldn't lose to Louisville because it would have been a complete disaster. They're not a good team. They almost lost to New Mexico State at home the other day, New Mexico State is a complete disaster of a program right now based on everything that went on there last year, and they're completely rebuilding. So couldn't lose that game. So Harvard, you feel a little bit bad. I thought Harvard was actually a pretty solid team. Don't like that they gave up 76 points, but they won by 13. I think you feel pretty good about that. Now we learn a little bit more, I think, these next 4 games. I would say overall my expectations are lower because for a couple reasons. One, we don't know the status of Xavier Johnson. It didn't look good that he was out the second half against Harvard. He's just sitting there in sweats with ice on his foot. He's already been hurt once earlier in the season, so I don't know exactly what his status is moving forward. If he can't play for any significant amount of time, that's a huge problem, obviously. 2, Mackenzie Mbako, while he did look better the last game, he doesn't seem as polished as I expected in terms of his ability to kind of plug and play and be a high-level wing-type player at this level. So I think by the end of the season, he could get there. So that's kind of lowered my expectations. And then the other thing is just the guard play in general has been underwhelming. You mentioned Trey Galloway. His shooting has not been very good. I think Gabe Cupps did some good things early in the season, but now that the competition's got a little bit better, not as effective. And CJ Gunn was somebody who was talked about a lot in the offseason. He's just been not improved so far from what I've seen. Not taking a shot at the kid, but he's not been able to make perimeter shots consistently. He got benched really the second half against Harvard in favor of Anthony Leal. I don't know if that was Mike Woodson sending a message or just feeling like Leal was a better option. That doesn't lend a lot of confidence for the development of the guard depth over the course of the season. So I would say I could still see a path to this team making the tournament if things break right. But right now I would kind of err on the side of them being a bottom half of the Big Ten team and bubble team at best, just based on what I've seen so far. And the trends defensively are not good. As you said, they're in the 80s and adjusted defensive efficiency. Got to be better than that if you want to win with any consistency in the Big Ten.
I agree with all that.
All right, Scott. Well, thank you once again for coming on the show. Thanks, everybody, for sticking with us after we took a break last week. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show and you're still listening after, 56 minutes here, please leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.